at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. This is where you start to see wisdom, and God's wisdom being embodied in Jesus himself, because Jesus is the Word of God through whom all things were made. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Renewal Bible in a Year podcast. My name is Pastor PJ Arsvold, and this is week 26, which is the halfway point. So, having completed this week's readings, you will have read half of the Bible, and I hope it is a blessing so far. So just imagine everything you've done so far, you just do that one more time, and you're all the way done. So hopefully it's been a joy. It's been a joy for me, and I'm excited this week as we finished up looking at the minor prophets. We looked at Psalms 1 and 2, and now this week we're going to be going into the book of Proverbs. So this is all wisdom literature, and we're going to spend all of this week and part of next week looking at this book. And as just a bit of a heads up, this is going to be a little bit of a different episode and a little bit of a different section because the reading is a little bit different. As you'll see, the book of Proverbs does not read like most books in the Bible. So we've had a lot of narrative and stories. We had prophetic writings, which had a lot of overlap, but they're not quite the exact same because the book of Proverbs is a book of wisdom. And you might know that phrase, a proverb. It's a saying, usually something like clever or very sticky in your head. Like it's something easy to remember, something well-worded that teaches some sort of life lesson. And so this is a book of wisdom, a book of Proverbs that give wisdom to how to live life, but obviously different than just your ordinary wisdom, your ordinary, proverbs that everyone uses every day. This is this is biblical wisdom. So this is given through God, through a number of people like Solomon, and ultimately then reaffirmed by Jesus when he shows up on the scene. So this is, you could say, very practical, everyday wisdom in a lot of sense, but it's also inspired and therefore beneficial. But it does beg the question of how we read some of this, because just as a heads up, what you're going to find in the book of Proverbs is, because these deal with everyday things, this is everyday wisdom. Some of it is observational, like this is just how the world is. Some of it is a clear, command. This is how you should do things. A lot of things are in the middle, like here's kind of how things are. So, here's some recommendations or, so act wisely. And sometimes it'll talk about prospering and stuff. And these are, you could say, generalities. So, for instance, it'll maybe say how the rich have things easier. And that's generally true in life, but it also talk about how, it's better to have nothing and be in a place of love and care than to have an abundance where there's strife. So it's kind of tackling some of the nuances, and sometimes you're even going to have proverbs that sometimes seem to almost contradict. And part of the fun, but part of the blessing of engaging with the proverbs is trying to reflect on them, apply them, figure out how far does this go? And so just some practical tips as we go forward through the book of Proverbs is when you come across any passage, any proverb, is to ask, first off, what is this saying, right? Because the language might use images or might use references that isn't, maybe not something that you and I would use today. So first off, what do I think this is conveying? And I can use a resource, obviously, if I'm not sure. You can always send it in to me too. Then you ask, how have I seen this? Is this line up with how I've seen life? So let me take this and kind of hold it up with real life and see, all right, oh yeah, those are the situations that this really fits in. And then are there situations where, that doesn't apply to, or maybe not as strongly, or it doesn't go as far. So for instance, one of the passages we'll look at today has to do with, it's better to be at a table of love eating vegetables than basically eating a fattened calf at a table of hatred or strife. So basically, it's better to eat meager, less nice food, to have less, have a worse possessions, but to be at a place where you're surrounded by people who love you, than it is to have the most fancy, expensive meal or possessions, but be in a place where there's strife and hatred, right? So that's, a lot of us can attest to that. How many kids, all they want from their parent is time with them. They don't need their parent to work a job to give them the best toys or anything, or the best trips or the best sports opportunities. The thing that they need most is just time and love from their parents, right? So we can kind of readily see that. But is there ever a place where if I ran with that wholeheartedly and made that a kind of an axiom where I never broke that, I could go too far? Well, what happens if I'm never willing to engage with anybody who hates me? I'm never willing to be around anyone who hates me. Is that how I'm supposed to live? Well, that's not really what Jesus did, because Jesus spent a lot of time with people who hated him too. So clearly there's a truth there that should be reflected on, and maybe that leads me to spend more time with my kids and stop only thinking about how much I'm giving them financially or materially, and maybe giving them more quality time. And so I have an action step I could do from that, but I also have to be careful not to just take that and just run with it to, the nth degree. I have to stop and say, is there ever a time where this doesn't apply? And so a lot of the wisdom of the Proverbs is hearing these, reflecting on these, and saying, how does this play out? Is there something I can do about this? When does this apply? When does it not apply? Or to what degree does it apply? And kind of wrestling with that. And so it's a book that invites us to slow down and really think and reflect and then hopefully apply this. And I mean, part of the blessing of the Proverbs and part of the blessing of the scriptures is if we think this way, if we learn this, if we can meditate on this, by God's grace, we're going to receive a lot of the blessings that it promises. That's not always health and wealth, but it does mean that sometimes things are going to go a little bit easier. It does mean that I'm going to be more in step with what God actually wants from this life. I'm going to have a more full life, a more abundant life, you could say. And so there's a huge blessing that comes from the Proverbs. And it's a book that's typically maybe just a little underappreciated, right? We don't spend a whole lot of time on it, partially because of the everyday nature of it, and partially because it's not as clear cut as the Gospels. Everything about Jesus is very clear, take it to the bank. The Proverbs takes a little bit of wrestling with, and if you just take a proverb and run with it all the way, sometimes it can be misleading. And so it takes a little bit more time to really sit with and learn and internalize and navigate. But in doing so, you gain wisdom, and wisdom is, as you'll see in the Proverbs, is a beautiful thing. All right, so with that, let's jump in. And so right off the bat, the first chunk of the Proverbs are all going to come from Solomon. So we're going to have a large chunk from Solomon and then some more of Solomon that were compiled by others. And then we'll have some sections of other people too. But you'll notice right at the very beginning of this book, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Now, if you remember way back when we read about Solomon in 1 Kings, Solomon, we were told, wrote a number of Proverbs. That was a significant part of his life. He studied animals and creatures and trees, and he was wise, and people sought his wisdom. So it makes sense that while he was living, he observed and, by God's spirit and leading, captured all of these Proverbs, these truths for us to observe. And so we're going to start off with a bunch of Solomon. Everything we read today is going to come from Solomon. Now, the first 9 chapters are almost like an invitation to the pursuit of wisdom, to the gaining of wisdom. 9 chapters kind of convincing and so laying out some principles for wisdom. And then once we get to chapter 10, you'll actually start to see what we consider kind of those true proverbs, those kind of usually 2-liners that have some sort of piece of wisdom that sometimes, seem to jump from topic to topic. But right off the bat is really just, again, an appeal for wisdom. So verse 2, this is the first kind of words of the Proverbs after the title, is basically to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealings, in righteousness, justice, equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and let the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So again, it's just an invitation to wisdom. Hey, it's a good thing to know wisdom, to understand words of insight, right? All of these things. And then at verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Think about how many people pursue knowledge and intellect and understanding in this world. And the Proverbs basically say the beginning of all of that is ultimately the Lord. Because he is the author of all things. He's the one who actually made everything. So if you really want to know what's what, you should seek him. And then any knowledge, any understanding is only going to come by his grace and his gift. So right off the bat, this kind of calling, here's what I'm here for. So you might seek wisdom, seek insight. And then in verse 8, he says, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. So as we kind of transition here, then you have this invitation to listen to one's parents. Now, this could be Solomon writing for his specific children, but I think even more so, this gets into a generational idea and the fact that one of the primary roles of parents are to pass wisdom on to their children. And I mean, this is, again, a tale as old as time. How many songs are written about how when I was young, I thought I knew everything, right? Back when I knew it all. That there's something about youth and youthfulness that we assume we know more than we do. We haven't lived. And part of aging and part of maturing is gaining wisdom. Oh, this is how the world is. This is how things are going to go well. And the importance of parents to teach that and pass it on and say, hey, one thing you need to know is this is how you should treat people. One thing you need to know is that this is going to make your life a lot harder, or this is going to make your life a lot easier. And then a call as children is to heed that and to listen to it. And part of the challenge as being young is that most of us are stubborn. We don't want to hear what our parents have to say. Like, how many of us have memories of feeling like we're being lectured at or whatever? But for all children to heed their parents' teaching and for parents to pass on wisdom. And what we'll see here too is wisdom is a lot more than simply just passively consuming a bunch of information. Like, I'm just watching a bunch of TV or I'm just listening to a bunch of podcasts like this one. But truthfully, like we said, the fear of the Lord, so diving into scripture and then observing life, meditating on what God has done, what I see, and gain some like real life experience paired with always going back to then what does God say, what has he revealed, and how does that play out? So wisdom is this very rich idea, this idea of to really understand who people are, what the world is, who God is, how things are supposed to go, how things seem to go. And again, the Proverbs are here to help us with that. And so that's part of the benefit of reading something like this. So right off the bat, basically hear your father's instructions. Don't forsake your mother's teaching. And then you have a bit of an enticement, you could say, or kind of an invitation or a temptation of the foolish, of sinners, of scoffers. There's a bunch of these words that you'll see as we read through. The simple. And basically these are all terms for those kind of in their disposition who are opposed to God's word. They're disobedient to their parents' teachings. They, think of scoffing, right? Like if your parents said, hey, you need to clean up your room, and you scoffed, you'd be like, what? Like, that's a scoff, right? You're turning your nose at it. You're mocking it. Likewise, simple, not being like some sort of mental capacity issue, but rather I'm not seeking wisdom. I'm just kind of being tossed around by whatever. And that's something that all of us can work on and ask God's help for. And so again, if wisdom is what we're after here, then the antithesis to that is being a fool or being foolish. Sometimes in the Proverbs, you'll see the word folly. And again, these are all this idea of not just like, I'm not very educated, right? It's not like the point of Proverbs is not get a PhD, and it's bad if you don't have one. The point of the Proverbs is heed your parents' instruction, gain wisdom, seek the Lord. And if you're not doing that, then you're a fool. And there's going to be a price to pay for that in how life goes for you and ultimately what happens. So you have this right off this bat that this basically Solomon's saying, hey, don't listen to those who would call for you, the scoffers, the sinners who would basically invite you to come and lie in wait for blood, right? So basically to do wickedness. So again, the wise move, the wise man, the wise woman will do what is righteous and good and just, and the fool will do what's wicked, what's wrong, what's evil, what's unjust. And so what he'll say is that basically these people, they this is verse 17 in chapter 1, in vain is a net spread in sight of a bird, but these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. So they're trying to sin, right, and do evil towards others, but ultimately they're the ones who are going to suffer the consequences. That's the idea here, which is why the next verse says, this is verse 19, such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessor. I think that's such a good verse, right? So for those who would seek unjust gain, so anytime you're gaining something wrongfully, so you sin to gain something, ultimately it's going to take away the life of its possessor. It sounds counterintuitive, right? Because you think you're the one gaining something. I was able to gain something, through my own means. But in reality, that thing that I've gained is taking my life, because there's something wrong when you choose that path. And so again, the call for Solomon is don't join them. Don't go down that route. And then in verse 20, you have wisdom being personified as kind of this woman in the town. So it says, wisdom cries aloud in the streets, in the markets she raises her voice. So she kind of is calling out to people and inviting them to come receive wisdom. She says in verse 22, how long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? So again, how long are you going to be comfortable with your foolishness, your simplicity, and your scoffing that opposes God's wisdom and God's knowledge and God's love? But in verse 23, if you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. So here's the promise. If you hear wisdom's call and you say, yeah, I want that wisdom, help me, teach me, then the wisdom spirit will be poured upon you. I mean, the New Testament will explicitly say that if you seek wisdom, ask it of the Lord and he'll give it to you. That it's a promise that if we ask for wisdom in this life, God will give it. That doesn't mean every answer is going to become clear. That doesn't mean we're not going to have to gain it through some maybe wrestling or circumstances, but he wants us to be wise, not in our own eyes, but ultimately in his law and his love. And so this is part of the promise. Turn to me and I will put my spirit upon you. And so there's more of this call. And then at the end of the chapter in verse 33, wisdom says, whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. So there's a security that comes from wisdom. There's a security and a dwelling of peacefulness that comes from true wisdom. Because again, ultimately true wisdom is built on God and a relationship with him. And so there's a security that comes from that even if circumstances aren't secure, my total understanding and my being is secure with him. Chapter 2 then just continues on this appeal to wisdom. In verse 1, we're told, my son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call up for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search it for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. So again, if you receive this word and treasure up my commandments, then you will ultimately receive this. You'll understand the fear of the Lord and find knowledge. Okay, so again, this is the promise. If you seek this, God's going to give it to you. For the Lord gives wisdom. So ultimately, all wisdom comes from him. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. And I love it. He goes on to say a couple of verses later that the Lord guards the path of justice and watches over the ways of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. So the idea that the Lord is watching over his people and he's guarding the paths of justice. He's the one who's kind of knows what's actually straight and where the way to go. And so if you seek him and understand his word, then you will understand righteousness, justice, and equity, every good path, right? All the good things. And you'll notice here, I'm going to just kind of jump around a little bit because there's a lot of good stuff, but it's sometimes repeated themes or phrased in a slightly different way. And so I'm going to highlight some things that I think are maybe particularly significant or just kind of pull some things out. If I don't talk about something, please feel free to reach out and ask, hey, what is this saying? Hey, I don't really get how this applies because I'm not going to have a chance to cover everything. But hopefully we can, again, get a lot of good stuff. As we go forward into chapter 3, I'll jump to verse 5. This is sometimes well known. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. Oh, it's so good. So again, this idea of trusting the Lord with all your heart, not leaning on your own understanding. So again, this is part of the pursuit of wisdom, is not just, what do I feel like? What sounds good to me? But saying what is actually true? What is actually helpful? What has God actually said? And if you, in all of your ways, acknowledge him, which involves then also seeking to do what he wants you to do, he's going to make your path straight. He's going to set you on the right path. And don't worry about being wise in your own eyes, but fear the Lord. And then this is a beautiful promise that will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. I mean, just the idea that seeking the Lord is ultimately this kind of refreshment, rejuvenation for us, right? And it's weary when we're trying to do it all on our own understanding and we're trying to figure everything out. But to trust in him and to follow him actually is refreshing, even as it's sometimes difficult as well. The next verses are also pretty big here. So verse 9 starts off with, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. And so the commandment is to always honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your produce. So that whatever you have financially, whatever resources you have, you are to honor the Lord with how you use that. And so this is obviously a big part of just understanding that everything we have was given to us by God. It's ultimately His. We're to worship Him and honor Him with our whole life. And so we should honor Him with our wealth. And he talks about first fruits, which again, in the biblical sense, this would be like most people didn't carry around a ton of money. Your income was basically the harvest that you maintained, right? You were able to harvest this much food for the year, and then you'd eat some, you'd sell some. But the point being that the first fruits that come in, the first part of your harvest, that's what you're giving to the Lord. You're saying, hey, I'm going to give Him the first 10th of what we're going to produce, and then I'm trusting that I can live off the 90% to come, rather than taking it all in, using it how I want, and then seeing what's left over. Now, in verse 10, he says, if you do this, right, your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine. Here's why the Proverbs have to be very careful, is because biblically you never see a promise. Well, you don't see that play out where if you give your first fruits, you're going to become rich in this life. And in fact, often it looks like it's quite the contrary, especially when you get to the New Testament. And yet this is a promise from God, right? So how do we understand this? Well, this is, again, the idea that God is going to ultimately take care of you. If you're worried about like, oh, I'm not going to have enough, so I'm not going to give any to the Lord, I'm not going to give to church, I'm not going to support ministry, whatever, then you're always kind of operating with a scarcity. But if you honor the Lord with your wealth and you give the first fruits of your produce, God will take care of you. And what does it look like for your barns to be filled with plenty, your vats bursting with wine? It might not mean that you're rich in this life, but it means that you'll have everything you actually need, right? That God's going to ultimately take care of you. He sees your needs. This is where Jesus talks about, right? Don't worry about storing up for yourself treasures on earth, but store up treasures in heaven. This is where Jesus talks about how your Father knows that you need food and clothing. And if you seek first the kingdom, then the rest of these things will be added to you. He'll take care of those things. And so again, there's a blessing that comes from honoring the Lord with your wealth and ultimately giving Him the first fruits. Not, hey, what's left over, but hey, right off the bat, Lord, I'm going to give you this, and I trust that you can help take care of me with the rest. And then the next verse, this gets to another big theme that we'll see throughout the Proverbs. But verse 11 says, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of His reproof, for the Lord reproves him whom He loves, as a father the son in whom He delights. So he's saying that the Lord will at times discipline us. So again, notice here this contrast, right? So wait, am my barns overflowing, or is the Lord disciplining me? That doesn't sound like, those feel like they're a little bit contradictory, or there's a tension there. And both are true, right? The Lord's going to take care of us. And also the Lord disciplines those that He loves. I think this is huge. And he points out that it's a father who ultimately reproves or disciplines a son that He delights in, right? When you care enough about a child, you care enough to discipline them. You care enough to expect something of them. An appropriate amount, right? You don't expect a 3-year-old to be able to function like an 18-year-old, but you do expect them to obey, to listen to a certain extent, right? And you're called to discipline them, to correct them, to point them on the right path. And we're going to see that throughout the Proverbs as well, the importance of taking discipline, of receiving reproof or rebuke. And the temptation of the fool is to disregard it, to scoff at it, right? I don't want to deal with that. Why are you making life hard for me? But here we're told that it's actually like the Lord disciplines us because He loves us. And this is the beautiful thing. Like if you ever go through a hard time, you're like, why is the Lord letting me go through this? Well, this is the crazy answer, but it might just be because He loves you, right? He loves you enough to say, I think and I know that you can endure this and grow from this and become even better at caring for others, even more loving. You're going to better understand my love and my will. And so I'm going to allow you to go through some discipline, some hardship, some challenge, but it's ultimately for your own good. And it's because I care. And if I didn't care, right, if I'm apathetic, I just let you do whatever you want, right? And if you think about, if you're raising a child and you're worried that they're going to go down a really bad route, right? They're going to steer themselves into fill in whatever your worst case scenario is. Let's say you're worried they're going to end up with a bad group of friends and they're going to end up making terrible choices and they're going to end up dying young because of whether it's drugs or other crazy lifestyle or the people they're hanging out in or a gang or whatever, fill in the blank, right? Basically, the point of discipline is I'm going to enforce something. I'm going to punish you. I'm going to do something to course correct. And so I'm disciplining so you don't go down that path. Hey, if you do that again, I'm going to have to take away this thing. I'm going to have to enforce this consequence. I'm going to have to, back in the day, spanking was the big one, right? I'm going to spank, whatever it is. I'm going to do something to you to steer you away, to show you that you shouldn't go that way. And so when you're tempted to go, oh, should I go hang out with that group of friends? No, if mom finds out, she's going to be really mad and she's going to punish me in this way or that way. Or when dad gets home, he's going to do this thing or that thing. And so I don't want to do that. And so disciplining is saying, I don't want to see you end up where that path is going to go. So I'm going to steer you the right way. And likewise here, we're told that this is how the Lord functions, that the Lord cares enough about us that he's like, I don't want to see you just waste your life away in sin and misery, but I actually care enough to sometimes put you through something uncomfortable to course correct you back to what you should be doing. And it's actually because I love you and I care about you. And I know you're actually capable of a lot of good things that'll be blessings in your life, right? And you hear sometimes people whose parents are very much like, hey, whatever you do is fine. Nothing you could do could ever disappoint me. I love you no matter what. And I think it's important to distinguish between unconditional love, I always love you, and expectations. So I can love you no matter what. No matter what you do, I'm always going to love you. But I do expect things of you. I expect you to do A, B, and C. And I expect those things because I know you're capable of them. So if you have no expectations for a child ever, like I don't expect you to treat people a certain way. I don't expect you to listen. I don't expect you to, whatever. In some ways it's saying like, I don't think much of you to be able to accomplish anything, to do anything. Because those expectations come from, hey, I know you're capable of treating people with respect, and so I expect you to treat people with respect. And if you disrespect people, I'm going to discipline you, right? That's the whole idea. So again, this idea of don't despise the Lord's discipline. So if life feels like it's disciplining you, don't despise that, but actually see that as God's love towards you, that he actually has expectations and hopes for you, and that's actually his care, just as a father would discipline their child. I'm just going to real quickly highlight in this chapter, in verse 19, it says, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew. We'll come back to this in a few chapters, but I just want to put a pin in that, because this idea that the Lord founded the earth by wisdom gives us a great connection for how we're going to see this book, even as it's very, practical, everyday wisdom, also connecting to Christ, because we believe that the whole Bible is about Jesus. And so we're going to see that wisdom is maybe deeper than we initially would think. I'll highlight in chapter 4, verse 10, it says, hear my son and accept my words, that the years of your life may be many. So again, if you remember, the fourth commandment is honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land that I'm giving to you. This idea that honoring your parents typically plays out in the fact that you're going to live longer, right? You're going to live, your life's going to be better for it. Now for the people of Israel, that was partially related to the promised land, but Paul will explicitly connect that to just a general promise to anyone who would honor their parents. Things will go better for you on this earth. That's a good thing. Things are worse when you dishonor your parents. And so you see that here in the Proverbs as well. The years of your life may be many. It's for your good, right? Your parents want what's best for you. They're not infallible, but they do have wisdom to listen to. In verses 18 and 19 then, we're told this, but the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. So there's a contrast here about those who are righteous, and that path is lit up, right? They can see where they're going. This is very much like Psalm 119, where we read about your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Also very reminiscent of Jesus being the light of the world. Whoever follows me shall not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life, right? But the way of the wicked is like a deep darkness. So again, wisdom, righteousness, everything that God is offering is meant to help us, to keep us from stumbling in the dark, basically. In chapter 5, then, there's the section where you have this woman. She's described, depending on your translation, as the forbidden woman, the adulterous woman. The word quite literally means stranger or strange woman. So basically, she's not part of your family circle. That's the idea. So the translation of adulterous or forbidden is a good one, because it's basically like, this is somebody you should not be with. This is not your spouse, is basically the idea. And so this idea of kind of guarding against her. And so this is where if wisdom was embodied by this woman, there's kind of this twofold nature to this chapter and to this other picture where you have this kind of seductive temptation who is both a picture of adultery, which in and of itself is sinful and has all sorts of problems, and is also an embodiment of kind of this foolishness, right? To be seduced away from the woman who is wisdom and seduced into folly and sin and wrongdoing. And so you kind of have this twofold. And I think adultery is actually a good embodiment of that idea. So this idea of this forbidden woman whose lips drip honey. So she's something about what she says. It's very sweet. It's very enticing, right? But ultimately her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. So going with her, right, is ultimately going to lead you into death. It's to your destruction. It's not good. And I just want to be clear too, this is using the picture of Solomon saying my son and this woman, but this, you could swap out genders here. The idea is really in this passage, right? This picture of unfaithfulness to marriage, of going and being with somebody who you shouldn't be with, right? If you're married to one person and you are going to the house of another, man or woman, right? And also again, this picture of going into foolishness and pleasures of this life and the temptations of this world that are not wise. And ultimately the picture is that's only going to lead to destruction. It's going to be problematic. The warning here too is that in doing so, you'd give honor to others, right? In your years to the merciless, that's verse 9. So this idea that, you're dishonoring yourself when you do this. When you're unfaithful to your spouse, you're dishonoring yourself, and others are, getting honor at your expense, basically. Like comparatively, they're being lifted up because you're losing honor. You're being shamed for what you've done, for this terrible thing. But then there's a contrast as you go forward. It says, drink water from your own cistern. So don't go in that seductive temptation over there, but go to the one of your own. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. And again, the idea of the wife of your youth is, again, not necessarily like how old you were when you got married, but the idea of, especially at this time and place, most people would be married fairly young. That was the norm. And so the wife of your youth was a shorthand for saying your spouse, right? Who you've been with, right? Stay faithful to your covenant you've made in marriage. Like that's an essential piece. So again, that's the real idea here is don't be tempted to be led astray into adultery, into whatever man or woman you might be tempted to go after, but delight in the one that you made that promise to, that you are married to, that you made those covenants with when you were married, and then join lives and bodies and minds and spirits and houses and finances and all of that. In chapter 6, we have Solomon saying that if you put up a security or a pledge, if you're caught in your words, you should go and plead with your neighbor. And really what this is saying is if you owe somebody something or you're kind of caught in something, go get resolution quickly, right? Because as long as you're indebted to somebody, maybe because you gave a pledge, you took out a loan, or in the case of your words, you said something, go make it right ASAP. He says basically like, give your eyes no sleep, your eyelids no slumber. Don't wait to resolve this, because as long as that's kind of outstanding, you're at somebody else's mercy. And so this is kind of just practical. Just if you owe somebody something, pay it off, get out of that situation, right? Later we'll see this idea of being in debt is kind of in a way enslaved to somebody. Like there's a blessing, right? A practical blessing in being free of debt if you can. Likewise, if you caught in your words, you lied about something, you said something, go make it right so this person no longer has something over you, right? Kind of that's the call here. In verse 6 then, this is chapter 6, verse 6, some people have heard this one. This is one that's kind of persisted a bit to today. He says, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. So another theme that you'll see throughout the Proverbs, in addition to fools and scoffers and simples, is this idea of a sluggard. And this is, I guess, a picture of laziness, of lacking the desire, the animation to go and to do something, an unwillingness to work for oneself, even though one is capable of it. And you can see, there's going to be a lot. You're going to see a lot of Proverbs that are really hard on those who would not work, who would be, lazy, who would oversleep and never, put in any labor. And so this idea of, this invitation to go to the ant, O sluggard, right? Like he's calling him a slug, basically, a sloth, you could say too. And look at the ant. This ant has no taskmaster. This ant's just kind of going about its business, but it's preparing bread, it's gathering food, it's doing its job. So why would you not do your job, right? Why would you not go do something about it? You'll see Proverbs 2, I'm just going to highlight this in verse 13 about winking the eye, which is really not about something like if, you can wink at your friends or your spouse or something. But when you see in the Proverbs this idea of winking, it has to do with kind of trickery, right? So typically winking, or not always, but often winking has a connotation of I'm saying one thing, but wink, wink, I'm going to do something else. So it's kind of an embodiment of kind of deception, tricking. And so those who would do that, who use crooked speech, who lie, who wink the eye, right? It's worthless. It's wicked. It's wrong to do. Verses 16 through 19 have a list of 7 things that the Lord does not like. So it's a good little list. Haughty eyes, lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet to make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. That's a good list of 7 things to ask. Do I sow discord? Do I cause division? Do I lie too easily? And so kind of a handy little list there. In the rest of chapter 6 and in chapter 7, you have more warnings and just proverbs against adultery and against adulteresses. So again, this is both adultery in how we live, to live sexually holy, but then also this kind of embodiment of leading to folly and evil. So for instance, in chapter 7, verse 4, he says, say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. So stay close to wisdom and insight so you're not led astray either into adultery or into the tempting adulterous folly and sin that one could go to. And this picture too talks about how this kind of embodiment of folly, this woman, this adulteress, is here meeting people, and men are turning aside and come into her house. But then in verse 22 in chapter 7, we're told, all at once he follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter, right? This is ultimately to his demise and to his doom. And again, I think, Paul will say that, there's a lot of sins right out there, but the one who sins in sexual immorality is committing something completely different, because you're sinning against your own body, because sex is such a sacred thing designed for certain confines that when that leaves the marital confines to which God made it for, there's a particular wickedness to it and a particular graveness to it that calls us to avoid it at all possible, to flee from it. Paul says, flee sexual temptation, get out of there. Don't try and fight it, run away. Don't put yourself in that situation. And then if we have sinned in the past, right, repentance and to ask for God's forgiveness, to which there's an abundance. But there's some strong warnings here against adultery. In contrast to that woman, then in chapter 8, we have once again wisdom calling, and she's raising her voice. So again, this is the right woman, right? Wisdom, and talking about how she's worth more than, silver, gold, jewels, right? It's so much better than that. But then I want to highlight this. So in verse 22, it says, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. There was no depths, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I mentioned this earlier, but this is where you start to see wisdom and God's wisdom being embodied in Jesus himself, because Jesus is the Word of God through whom all things were made. And we'll see that really clearly in the New Testament. But here we see this same picture, that wisdom is the one through whom God created everything. And we'll see in the New Testament where Paul will explicitly call Jesus the wisdom of God. So I'm just highlighting that even here, you have kind of this twofold sense, right? There's kind of this twofold reading of wisdom. Wisdom, it kind of transcends even the material world. Like even before, there was particles and molecules and creatures, there was wisdom. So wisdom is crucial. It's not just like a fluky thing. It's not just, well, this is helpful, but this is an essential part to how God has made the world, is that there's this thing called wisdom. But also, wisdom is most clearly embodied and personified and really is Jesus himself. He is the wisdom of God, and he is the one through whom all things are made. And so you can kind of see, this is one of those places when you look back from the New Testament, you see, oh man, I didn't realize that in the midst of all these Proverbs in the book of Proverbs, there's Jesus just popping up here. But very clearly just that idea of Jesus as the wisdom of God through whom all things were made here in Proverbs chapter 8. And then chapter 9 is our last little bit before we get into the actual, Proverbs here. And so again, just an encouragement about the purpose of wisdom, the blessing of wisdom. You have a little bit here. It says, this is verse 8, do not reprove a scoffer or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man and he will love you. So this is a good little contrast here. So for a scoffer, somebody who would scoff at God's will, scoff at wisdom, if you try to reprove them and correct them, hey, you did something wrong. Hey, you can't be doing that. They're going to hate you for it. But a wise man will love you. And this is, a good reminder for all of us. We talked about discipline from the Lord, but also reproof, right? That's kind of related, that it's a blessing to be able to receive correction and instruction. And our natural defense is to become defensive and deflective and, self-preservationist. Hey, no, you're misunderstanding me. No, I didn't say that, right? No, you're clearly wrong. You're coming after me, whatever. But for the wise person, if you want to be truly wise, to be able to hear instruction or reproof and actually appreciate it, right? To say, oh, thank you. That's really helpful. Oh, man. Because again, the idea of a reproof is to correct you. It's to help you become better, right? To do more righteously, to do more lovingly, whatever it is. And so, this is something that you spend your whole life working on. I certainly, I am somebody who, so desperately wants to be able to hear feedback on stuff and, not flinch. I want to be somebody who, gets excited about feedback. Somebody's like, hey, just so you know, when you gave that talk, you said this, I think you were a little wrong on that, or I think this came off kind of weird. I would love to be somebody who hears that and is like, oh, thank you so much for telling me. I love that. That's so helpful. I would be lying if I said I'm there already. Definitely, my first instinct is take a breath because you want to get defensive. You want to justify yourself. And then you hopefully, then over time I try and process it and appreciate it for the feedback it is. But the idea that a wise man will actually appreciate correction and reproof, where a fool or a scoffer or a sinner will simply hate the person for trying to correct them. All right, and then we get into chapter 10, which again this is where we're going to get into those little proverbs. And so right off the bat, the Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. A couple things. First off, you'll see this pattern often where you'll use synonyms or pairings like this. So you'll notice it said father and mother. The first line was father, second line was mother. Those are, basically it's just trying to say parents, right? But it's just it's a poetic way of restating something or reframing something. So Hebrew will often want to do this, where you see this in the Psalms all the time, where you'll have a second line that'll almost say the exact same thing, but it'll use synonyms for it or something related. So don't take this as only a father can be glad and mothers can be sorrowful, but rather, right, this is the joy of parents, right? And I think this is just a truism, right? To have a wise child is a great pride for their parents, to say, wow, what a great kid, look at what they're doing. But a foolish child is ultimately a sorrow to their parents, right? Do they still love the kid? Of course. But to see them doing what they're doing, it causes them sorrow and it causes them pain. And they wonder, what happened? Did we, you ask yourself all these questions, did I not do something right? Because you're making all these bad choices, or you're acting all foolishly. And so this kind of truism that ultimately a wise child is to the blessing of their parents, that they can take pride in it. It gladdens them to see, but it's sorrowful to see their child, living foolishly. And foolishly, again, being opposed to God's wisdom. That's the idea here. We talked about this theme a little bit already, but here you have in verse 4, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. So again, this idea of one whose hand is slacking, so not really working. Think of a rope when it's slack, it means it's not pulled tight. So the idea of a kind of a lazy hand that's not doing anything, the proverb saying that leads to poverty, because if you're not working, you're not producing, you're not making money, but the hand that's diligent makes rich. Now, obviously, again, this is not promising that anyone who works hard is going to become a millionaire or something, but it's saying that For the one who's willing to work, you're going to actually receive an income. You're going to actually take care of yourself. But the one who's not willing to, it's going to lead to poverty because, you should be working for your living. Obviously, there's circumstances where you're not able to, but this is the ordinary for people. God has designed people to work. God has designed people to provide for themselves or their families. And somebody who's just flat out not willing to do that is outside of God's order of the world. And so that's what's playing out here. In verse 7, we're told the memory of the righteous is a blessing, but the name of the wicked will rot. So the idea that for those who live righteously, their memory is a blessing, right? To them, because they're remembered, they're carried on to generations, and it's a blessing for those who are remembering them as well. In chapter 11, here we've talked about this in the prophets, but we have it right away in verse 1, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. So again, this idea of false balances and just weights being a fair trade, right practices. So again, just when you hear the kind of picture, because again, we're not weighing stuff usually, just think through am I somebody who is being honest and fair in my dealings? Like when I'm making a transaction with somebody or I'm making a deal with somebody or an agreement with somebody, am I trying to pull a fast one on them? Am I trying to see if I can sneak something by? Or am I being completely fair and just in my dealings? That's the idea. In verse 2 then, there's a warning against pride. So when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom. So if you're prideful of yourself, ultimately it's going to lead to disgrace. But with humility, and then you're going to have wisdom, true wisdom, which again goes back to am I here to preserve my own image or am I here to become wise? And if I'm willing to become wise, I'm acknowledging I'm probably not all the way wise yet. So I want to take corrections and so on. Jumping down to verse 12, whoever belittles his neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding remains silent. And so this goes into the next verse too. Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered. So the idea that one who would kind of share their neighbor's secrets, belittle them. Hey guys, can you believe what they did? Let me tell you about what my coworker did. Let me tell you about my mom, or my mother-in-law or my father-in-law, whoever it is, right? You're lacking sense if you're just tearing people down with your words. But somebody of understanding is going to remain silent. I don't need to, just because I know this thing about them doesn't mean I have to share it with everybody. Again, just kind of a good principle. Verse 14, where there's no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors, there's safety. So if you're going through life without any guidance from people, it's going to probably lead to fall if you're just leaning on your own intellect. But in an abundance of counselors, listening to other people, it's going to ultimately, there's a security, there's a safety there. In verse 22, we're told, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. So it's a good reminder that for men and women, life is more than appearance and beauty. And for somebody who is, maybe the most beautiful person of all, but doesn't have godly discretion, right? And godly wisdom, it's basically like putting a golden ring on a pig's snout is what the proverb is saying. That part looks beautiful, but the whole thing doesn't work, right? True beauty, right? In this case, the animal wearing the ring is found with godly wisdom, godly discretion, godly virtue, right? That's true beauty. And if inside, you're wicked, lack discretion, lack God's wisdom, but externally, you're, very beautiful. It's like putting a gold ring on a pig's snout. It's a powerful image there, sharp image. 2 verses later, verse 24, one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. So again, this kind of observation that, hey, it seems like the ones who are generous seem to be plenty blessed, right? In all sorts of ways. Maybe not always monetarily richer, but the one who's giving freely grows richer, but the one who withholds what he should give. So he should be giving something. He's not giving it. He finds himself suffering want. And this is just generally true. If you're after money, you're never going to have enough money. No, it's crazy, right? How many people do you know? You watch somebody online, social media, pick one of our billionaires in the world. And it's they're always trying to find ways to save more money and get more money. And you're just but you have more than you could ever spend. I don't know why you need more. Why do you still suffer want? Why do you want more money? You have way more than I could ever, than you could ever use. And so instead, the one who freely gives will find themselves plenty well off. You're going to be taken care of. You're not going to have every monetary thing you want in this life, but you will be plenty blessed. I mean, Jesus quite literally says that it's more blessed to give than to receive. A few verses later, in verse 29, we're told whoever troubles his own household will inherit the wind. So this is, I think, helpful. This is kind of, it almost feels like a double meaning here. So trouble your own household. So you're causing problems to your family, right? You're going to inherit the wind. So first off, all of these things you're doing, they're going to amount to nothing, like trying to hold on to the wind. It's kind of nothingness. But then secondarily, I mean, there's also a truth where like, if you cause a lot of problems in your family, like you might get taken out of the will, right? I mean, there's like almost a double meaning here. So again, kind of a warning, like don't cause unnecessary strife in your household. Don't unnecessarily, cause problems with your parents, your grandparents, your aunts, uncles, cousins, siblings. Like that's not needed. It's not going to benefit you at all in any way, shape, or form. In chapter 12, we'll jump to verse 10. It says, whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. And so I think this is kind of interesting. The righteous has regard for the life of his beast. That true righteousness and righteous living also means that you care about animals and creatures. That doesn't mean you don't eat them for those livestock that we do eat, but it means that you aren't cruel to them. And the idea of being cruel even to animals is truly wrong, right? And again, we talked about this with the book of Jonah, that when God's like, why would I want to destroy Nineveh when it has so many people and so many cows? Like, wait, I got the people part. You care about all those cattle, God? And it's like, yes, because God made the cattle. God made horses and donkeys and dogs and cats and all sorts of creatures and animals. So anyone who loves God would not be intentionally cruel to any of his creatures. And that includes animals as well. I'll highlight in verse 15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. So this is just a good principle too. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes. If you come up with an idea, it's always going to sound good to you because it was your idea, right? And one of the challenges is not just saying, well, I thought of this, it sounds good to me, but let me seek advice from others. Let me get feedback from others before I go forward and do this decision. I mean, I think about this sometimes as a pastor, and then also part of just a church is sometimes people make big decisions in life and they'll say things like, I just, was really thinking this through and this is what's best for me. Or I've been praying a lot and I just have peace with this decision. And sometimes, maybe I've shared this before, but sometimes it's a little bit like it's murky. You're like, I don't really know what you should have done. That is kind of tough, but it would have probably been helpful for you to talk to other people. And then sometimes the decision, I believe, is just flat out opposed to what God has clearly said. And so understanding that whatever we're doing, whatever way we want to go, I'm not here to be wise in my own eyes because it's always going to sound right to me if it's what I want to do, right? That's the thing when you're trying to deliberate with something, if your heart has a stake, and sometimes your heart is deceitful, right? Oh man, this would be really nice. Well, maybe it does make sense. Maybe God didn't really mean it when he said I shouldn't do that or I should do this, right? Whatever it is, I'm not here to, I know that whatever I think is going to sound right in my own eyes, but rather seeking advice from brothers and sisters, from pastors, from whoever, and seeking out that. Another common theme in the Proverbs is the idea of how we speak. So in verse 18 here, there's one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. So there's a contrast here between the rash, one who just speaks out of their kind of anger and frustration without thinking. That's like a sword thrusting into somebody. They're going to hurt somebody. They're going to harm somebody. It's going to cause destruction. But the tongue of a wise person can bring healing and will bring healing. So speaking out of wisdom and love, you can actually bring healing rather than destruction. As we go to chapter 13, in verse 3, we're told, whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. This is the biblical version of the modern proverb, loose lips sink ships, right? This idea of if you're just kind of yapping and saying whatever without thinking, it's going to lead to problems, right? If you're sharing all sorts of, you're just chatting away and talking about all sorts of problems with anybody and everybody, like it's usually going to cause more issues. But somebody who guards their mouth is actually it's going to be to their benefit. That doesn't mean you never talk. That means you think through, what am I going to say? What should I say? What's appropriate? What would be beneficial? What's harmful, right? So you think through what you're going to say. In verses 7 and 8, you have kind of two proverbs, so I'm going to take them together. One pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. And then the ransom of a man's life is his wealth, but a poor man hears no threat. So both of these obviously pertain with poor and rich. I think it's interesting. The first one is kind of this observation that like people want to have money. People want to give that impression. So the idea of that there are people who pretend to be rich yet have very little, right? So how many times do we rack up credit card debt so we can, live above our means because we want to, live a certain status, a certain lifestyle. But then another pretends to be poor yet has great wealth. And maybe you've met these people who you have no idea that they probably have a lot of money because they live humbly. They're not trying to flaunt it. They're not trying to show it, right? So there's you can see two different tracks there of the person who has maybe nothing, but is trying to show everyone, hey, look at what I am. And then somebody who has plenty, but doesn't feel the need to live that up or to show it off or anything. Now, the next proverb, the idea of the ransom of a man's life is his wealth, but a poor man hears no threat, is speaking to the reality that when you have stuff, you can live with the fear that you might lose it, right? So if you imagine, like if I had, I don't know, $30,000 in my bank account and somebody was blackmailing me, right? What could they reasonably blackmail me for? For like $30,000, right? Like, give me all that money. But if you had $500 in the bank, like, what are they going to take? Like, all right, here's $500. Great, right? That's significant, right? But notice how it's actually sometimes in the riches where you're like, oh, but what if I lose it, right? And that's, one of the paradoxical truths about wealth is that wealth often brings the sense of security, right? Sometimes a dangerous sense of security because we start to think we don't need God because we have enough money to make our problems go away or to withstand anything. But sometimes it feels like, all right, so I have a bit of security because I'm financially like at a good spot. But it also comes with the question of, well, what happens if I lose it, right? So, I'll just put it this way. For somebody who's living, who has $20 in their bank account, the idea of having $0 in their bank account seems much more livable than somebody who's sitting with $100,000 in their bank account. Because for that person, they can't imagine what it's like to possibly have nothing, right? So that's like that's the ransom of their life because you could give it all away. But to somebody who has nothing, like, well, you're going to take this 20? All right, fine. Somebody on the street might give me 20 more back later, so I'll be fine, right? Like you're not as fearful potentially, right? Often, again, these are where the Proverbs are generalizations often. But you're potentially not as fearful of every little thing because you're like, well, I have next to nothing, so I'm not so worried about losing it. Where the person who has a lot feels like they have a lot to lose, okay? In verse 11 then, this has to do with money again here. A wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. And so this is a warning against trying to get rich fast scheme, right? Money gained hastily tends not to stick around, but kind of slow, saving, hardworking, wise stewardship tends to endure, right? Many of us have probably experienced that too. I'm going to jump to verse 20. And I want to use this as an example of how you can engage with the proverb. So earlier I talked about interpretation and then asking, how have I seen this play out? And then are there limits to this? And then what might I do with this piece of knowledge or this piece of wisdom? I think verse 20 might be a good example of this. So it says, verse 20, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but with the companion of fools will suffer harm. All right, so if I'm just trying to interpret that, so it seems to be that those who walk with the wise, now I'm going to assume that this is more than just going for a stroll, although that could be part of it, but one who spends their time with, one who lives with, one who walks through life with, is friends with, family with, those who are wise will become wise. All right, so you kind of gain their wisdom, but a companion of fools will suffer harm. So it's to my detriment if my companions are all fools. And again, don't take fools as in like low mental capacity, but as in lacking God's wisdom, right? Sense of reverence and a heeding of God's word and God's truth. So that's the interpretation. So if I'm with one way, if I want to reword this in my own words, if I'm with people who do godly things, I'm going to become more godly. If I'm with people who do things that are wise and good, I'm going to become more wise and good. And if instead I spend all my time with people who are foolish or sinful, I'm probably going to become more foolish and sinful. That would be, another way to put this proverb. This is, again, chapter 13, verse 20. So then if I'm reflecting on that, I might say, all right, how have I seen that play out? Well, I can just say that, there's an old, I don't know if it's that old, but there's a lot of research and stuff that says you are a combination of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I can say for my own life, that seems to track. Like when I think of different phases of my life, the friend groups that I was with, I talked like them, I joked like them, I thought like them. I'm not identical, but it definitely had a huge influence on me. And I've seen other people too. I've seen people who I was very similar to. Like I can think of a friend, we used to be very similar. And then we ended up in 2 different groups of people and kind of got on 2 different trajectories and just I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying we ended up very different, right? Because we were different people, thought differently. And so I can see the influence that people has. And so this might be an encouragement to think through, who am I spending my time with? Is it people that I want to become more like? Or are they people that I'd say, oh, geez, I don't ever want to become like that, right? That's not good. And so I might say, hey, I should spend more time with people who are truly wise or truly godly. Now, I also talked about when does this apply? So is this a universal all the time? Well, this is where I think it's always helpful to go back to Jesus. Did Jesus only hang out with those who were wise and trusted the Lord rightly? Well, no, he didn't. He spoke with all sorts of people who were sinners and scoffers and foolish and Pharisees, and he actually talked to them. So I can't just cut off everybody from my life who is, maybe isn't the most godly, right? I mean, nobody would ever hear about Jesus if people who cared about Jesus only ever hung out with people who already care about Jesus, right? So there is a limit to this. So I might start to think through, all right, what does it look like for me to spend kind of my core companions, my core people that I want to become like, while also making sure that I have time to befriend and care for and invest in other people as well. Okay, so that might be just how you might take these Proverbs. And again, you can pick any of these. You can pick one about working and what's the right balance between working hard and having diligent hands, and what point does that become too much. So you can do this with any proverb, but that would just be kind of a template again, is to try and reword it. What is this proverb saying? What's the essence? What's the idea? How have I seen this play out in my life or around me? And then are there limits to where this might go? Is there a point where this no longer applies, or do I need to kind of nuance it maybe in my understanding? And then, what might I do to actually put this into practice? I'll highlight this in verse 24. I've talked about this topic already, but whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. So, this is where the rod here is referring to kind of an equivalent to what spanking would have been. You would have used a rod to kind of do a physical discipline on your child. And so the proverb saying anyone who hates their child will not discipline them, but the one who loves their child will discipline them. You don't have to use a rod, but the discipline part's the non-negotiable here. You have to rebuke, correct, reprove, direct them if you really care about them and don't want them to just wander off into wherever they might wander. In chapter 14, as we continue on, I'm going to jump to verse 9, where it says, fools mock at guilt offerings, but the upright enjoy acceptance. So again, if you think about guilt offerings are part of one's sacrifices. So the fool, which we don't want to be, would kind of mock at any sort of sacrifice to God, right? That's foolish, that's silly. But the upright enjoy the blessing and love, revere the sacrifice to God. That's the idea here. In verse 10, it says, the heart knows its own bitterness and no stranger shares its joy. It's the idea that only the heart can truly know what it's feeling. I think this is just a kind of an observation that nobody can truly know what it's like, what one's own heart is going through. One can try to understand, one can try to empathize, but you can't really know. It's kind of just for oneself to feel that. In verse 15, we're told the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. So again, the simple is a version of the fool here. And so the simple here is one who just believes everything. And everything they're told, they're just like, that's true, right? Somebody says, you should do this. And you're going, okay, I guess I should do that. But the prudent, right, the wise person is actually going to think through, is that right? Why is that right? Who says that's right? Does that actually play out, right? You're going to actually think about it and process it and not just accept it blindly from anybody you hear on Twitter or on a podcast or a friend or teacher, right? You actually weigh out, why is this trustworthy? Why is this true? As we look at verse 20, it says, the poor is disliked even by his neighbor, but the rich has many friends. So this is just an acknowledgement, kind of an observation that it's, when somebody has nothing to offer, people seem to turn, don't give them the time of day, right? Even their neighbor seems to dislike them, but somehow the rich has many friends, right? People seem to gravitate towards him or her. So again, it's kind of just an observation of how that plays out. But I think that's really helpful when you go to verse 21, next verse. Whoever despises his neighbor is a sinner, but blessed is he who is generous to the poor. So it's kind of acknowledging that in this world, people seem to want to be friends with those who have money and status and possessions, and people don't seem to have the time of day for those who have nothing. But one who is truly wise, who wants to be blessed, is ultimately not going to despise the poor, but is going to be generous. So I'm going to take care of my neighbor and his needs. I'm going to give to those who have little. And so don't be like the world, who just despises those who have nothing to give them back, but actually be generous to them. A couple of verses later, we're told, in all toil there's profit, but mere talk tends only to poverty. So it's a good proverb to remind us not just to talk about doing stuff, but we actually have to work. Toil will ultimately produce something. If we're actually trying to accomplish something, we're actually putting our hands to something, it's usually going to lend to something hopefully good. But if it's just mere talk, it's going to end with nothing. Verse 29 says, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. So again, the idea of being slow to anger, not just so quick to jump to things, but actually to consider, to think through what we say and what we do. The next verse says, a tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. So having a content heart that's content and appreciative of what God has given it ultimately gives you life. You're going to be more full of life when you're grateful for what you have and at peace with what you have. But if you're envious of what others have and what you don't have, then it's like your bones are going to rot. So it's not great. In verse 31, we're told, whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. So when you oppress the poor, who are you actually insulting? You're insulting God, because God made that man or woman just as he made you. So instead, you should be generous to the needy. And in doing so, you're actually honoring God, which lines up when Jesus talks about his people in final judgment. And he's like, you fed me when I was hungry. You clothed me when I was naked. And they're like, when did we feed you or clothe you? And he says, whenever you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it for me, right? I'm the one who made them. And so when you took care of them, you were actually taking care of me. In chapter 15, we have this is also maybe a well-known proverb today. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So the idea that when let's say somebody comes and yells at you, or they have a complaint and they're mad and angry, if you respond with a harsh word, it's only going to escalate things, right? People are going to get more angry. But if you give a soft answer, right? You speak calmly. That doesn't mean you have to back down or you have to, coward or apologize for something you didn't do or something. But if you can give a soft, thoughtful answer, it has a tendency to turn away wrath and kind of defuse the situation. In verse 3, we're told the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. It's a good reminder that the Lord is always watching everywhere, everything that happens. Verses 16 and 17 are kind of a pair here. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a fattened ox and hatred with it. I mentioned that second one earlier, but the whole point of both of these being it's better to have very little in life, but to fear the Lord and be where love is, than to have an abundance where you have, trouble and you don't know the Lord and there's hatred, right? So just reprioritizing, because it's so easy and so enticing to really gravitate towards material wealth and all sorts of, the temptations of good food and a good life. But what makes a good life is actually loving family and friends and the trust of the Lord. Those are really what's going to make a good life at the end of the day. Verse 22 says, without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. We talked about this earlier, but again, if you're not talking to anybody else about, decisions, more likely to fail. But if you talk to other people and pool your wisdom together, more likely to succeed. Verse 23, to make an apt answer is a joy to a man, and a word in season, how good is it? So it's just kind of acknowledging what a blessing when somebody has kind of the perfect thing to say, right? When you're going through something, it's a joy, and hopefully a joy to be able to speak that and share it with others as well. In verse 33, we have the fear of the Lord is instruction and wisdom, and humility comes before honor. That second part, I think, is sometimes repeated today. Humility comes before honor. This is best seen in Jesus, who ultimately humbles himself. I mean, he takes the form of a man, washes his disciples' feet, and is crucified. And because of that, then he's exalted as Lord of heaven and earth and rises from the dead. And so likewise, remember that humility comes before honor, that instead of trying to honor yourself, first humble yourself and let the Lord exalt you. The beginning of chapter 16, we have a little bit of this, again, just the reminder that it's the Lord who ultimately brings success. So the plans of the heart belong to a man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So we can have all of our plans, but ultimately the answer is from the Lord. It's a good reminder in prayer that the Lord invites us to pray for anything and hope for anything, but ultimately we trust that and know that he's going to do what he knows is best. And so he hears us, he acts according to it, but he ultimately does, why we say, thy kingdom come, right? Your will be done, Lord. And likewise, again, all the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. So everything sounds good to us, right? And we might even think our intentions are pure, but the Lord actually knows our spirit and what's going on. And ultimately, if we commit our work to the Lord, your plans will be established by him. So if it's his working, then he will bring it to fruition. In verse 11, it says, a just balance and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. So again, that's the idea of that just balance or scale. But I like this proverb because it says that is the Lord's, because anything that is truly just is the Lord's doing. I think that's kind of a cool idea there, that those just like the weights in your bag to weigh out the flour that you're about to sell. If that's a just weight, that's because the Lord is just, and that's his weight right there. Verse 14 says, a king's wrath is a messenger of death, and a wise man will appease it. So this is just an acknowledgement of like when a king who has authority to, sentence people to death is wrathful or mad at you, right? He could send you to death. So a wise man is going to try to appease it. This is another one that I think is helpful to think through in terms of like when I talked about that kind of structure. So let's take this one. So what does this mean? It means that for those who are in authority, so think governmental, civil authority, that's what a king would have been in this time and age, that when he's mad at you or he's opposed to you, he has the ability to punish you. And if you're wise, the smart thing to do, if you fear God, you're going to appease it. You're going to try to avoid his wrath. This lines up with the New Testament where we're told to obey the civil authorities because God has established them. We should be obedient to them, that they are not a terror to those who do good, but to those who do evil. And so what is this? How have I seen this? Well, I've seen a lot of people who are very content to provoke officers, to provoke military, to just ridicule and disregard and disobey authorities in our government, whether national, state, or local, right? I've seen that on the news. I've seen that all over the place, that people are very comfortable disregarding it. And sometimes, tragically, it ends up with people being punished for breaking the law, or sometimes in rash moments, sometimes people, being harmed or hurt or even dying. So a wise person, if they have a sense that these authorities are angry with me or are provoked, I should try to appease that. And so I might think through like, all right, I want to use my words and my actions to honor authority. Now, we talked about, when does this apply? Does this mean all the time? Well, no, there are times when the authorities are out of line with what God wants them to be doing. So they are perpetuating injustice. They are doing wrong. And so there are times when I need to, stand up against them. I might need to speak out against them. But even then, I'm not trying to provoke them to anger. I'm trying to create change. I'm trying to speak God's truth to them. And so I might think through, what does it look like to advocate for change? What does it look like to stand up for something in accordance with God's justice, in accordance with God's will, opposed to the authorities if I think that they are opposed to it. And I mean, truthfully, this is where Christians at times, the authorities have said, you can't profess Jesus. Otherwise, you're going to be put to death. And people were willing to provoke the wrath of those nations and say, no, I'm going to profess Jesus to the death. And so ultimately that, it could be a high calling if that's the case. But most of the time, that's not the stake for most of us in today's world. There's definitely some around the world, but not everybody, not most people. But we should think through, all right, am I somebody who is okay with bringing authorities to wrath? Am I okay with provoking them and dishonoring them? Or am I trying to be obedient and respectable and submissive as much as I'm able to while still following God's law and God's will? And if I need to see a change, is there a better way to carry out a change rather than provoking? So that would be another way to engage with a proverb like this. Then in verse 18, this one has stuck around. So pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. So this sometimes gets shortened as pride comes before the fall, right? It's when you're prideful of how great you are, what you're doing, how maybe you get too arrogant, and that usually comes before everything comes tumbling down. The next verse, it is better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. So again, if pride's so bad, it's better to have very little and be poor, but also ultimately be of a humble spirit than to have a big spoil, right? To have a lot of riches, but to be with the proud. So again, what's truly valuable? Humility is more valuable than wealth, is basically the contrast there. In verse 26, a worker's appetite works for him. His mouth urges him on. So this is just the kind of reality that when you know, hey, I'm not going to eat tonight if I don't work this job and get a paycheck, your appetite's what's going to kind of spur you on to go do something, to go work. And so it's kind of how God's designed it too. Like, we need to live. And so that desire for eating and having a place to sleep actually motivates us to go and work. Where the worst parts of us will sometimes say, if that's all secure, then I'm just going to, sit around and do nothing all day, right? I'm just going to live for pleasure all the time, and I'm never going to contribute anything. I'm never going to go help anybody. A couple verses later, a dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisper separates close friends. It's the idea that somebody who lies is causing problems, and a whisper separates close friends. So whether they're whispering lies or spreading secrets, that has the ability to tear apart friendships. So again, wisdom would say, be smart about what you're saying, be honest, be upstanding with what you're talking about. A few verses later, we're told gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. I love this, the idea that gray hair is a sign that you've lived for a while, and that's actually to your glory and to your honor. And it's like a crown that God has put upon your head to show everyone, like, hey, this person has walked with me for a long time. They've actually gained wisdom. They're not the same foolish kid they used to be. I think this is especially helpful in an age where youth culture is just so worshipped. Everybody's just trying to look younger. Everybody wants to look young so long. And it's not that you can't color your hair. It's not that you can't try to look a little younger. But ultimately, the idea that to see gray hair is not something to be terrified of, not something that's ugly. Because again, that's the whole idea of so much of this world is if you are old, that's bad. We don't like old, so you shouldn't look old because that means you have less value. That means we don't like you, right? But actually, God's view is, hey, I have loved you long enough I've loved you so much, I've given you this long life. And as a crown to show everybody how long you've been walking with me and how much life I've given to you, here's a crown upon your head in the form of gray hair. So I think it's beautiful. I think as Christians to start to think that way, that if, again, you can color your hair, but if we can, as Christians, embody that it's not a bad thing to be old, right? That it's not a thing to be feared, but it's a thing to actually celebrate. Well, gosh, God has given me this much life, right? We react to funerals differently. Right? When somebody is 85 and they die, we usually react differently than if they die at the age of 23, right? Because we think oh no, I can't believe that person was cut off so young. And that is too young, right? So why is it that we act like it's bad to be 85 if we think that it's better to live to 85 than 23, right? And so to see age is actually a blessing from God, even as, yes, it comes with health challenges and it comes with you move slower, you can't do what you used to do. It comes with memory challenges. Those are all true. And in the resurrection, those won't be a problem anymore. But to still see it as a blessing from God, and to see gray hair is actually a crown that God has given somebody to say, look at this life that I've given to them. They've lived long enough for their hair to turn gray. And again, our life expectancies are a little bit longer than back then. So we maybe take that for granted too, but especially in a day and age where, infant mortality was so much higher. I mean, getting to live to an old age, to see your children and your children's children, just a huge deal. That is a gift from the Lord. In chapter 17, this is an example of just kind of calling things what they are. So in verse 8, a bribe is like a magic stone in the eyes of the one who gives it. Wherever he turns, he prospers. Now, the Bible is very explicit that bribery is wrong. And the Psalms will talk about that it's perverting justice. And as well as I think some of the Proverbs will touch on this as well. But this is just an acknowledgement of when you watch the world, somebody who's bribing people, it seems like they're prospering wherever they go. Ultimately, we know that in the end, they will not prosper, right? It will not be to their good. But this is just an acknowledgement of here's how things are playing out in front of me. Then verse 9, it says, whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends. So again, if you're willing to not cover up as in hide an offense, you're not trying to think of a movie with a cover up, no, we're trying to conceal the truth from people. But when somebody has sinned, instead of telling everybody, to just accept that, bear with it, forgive it, and keep it between you and them, that's an act of love right there. We've talked about how the wise man will actually welcome reproof and correction. In verse 10 here, it says, A rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding than 100 blows into a fool. So basically, a man of actual understanding, you can rebuke him and say, hey, you did this wrong. Hey, you were wrong about this. And it'll actually sink in and resonate with them deeper than if you were to hit a fool 100 times, like just hit them, because they're just so stubborn-minded, right? They're just so unwilling to receive that. So just the wise one is going to receive those words and trust it. In verse 17, we're told a friend loves at all times and a brother is born for adversity. I love this. So a true friend is going to love at all times, not just when things are going well. And a brother is born for adversity. The idea of those who can cling tightly to you even when things are hard. And again, you see this a lot with people who go to, who are in the military together, who maybe go to war together. But this is true of anybody who endures hard things together. There's a bond there. And the idea that God has given us friends and siblings and people in our lives, not just for the good times, but for the hard times, the adverse times as well. In verse 28, we're told, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. I love this. It's just acknowledgement of like, you might not be the wisest, but if you just keep quiet, often, nobody would know. Like we often, and sometimes the quiet people in the corner that are like, you're like, oh man, what are they thinking about? I think the modern version of this, right, is it's better for everyone to assume that you're a fool than to open your mouth and prove it. It's kind of that idea. Like if you don't have anything intelligent or wise to say in this or to speak into this, just best not to say anything. A couple of verses later, this is now into chapter 18. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. So how many people do you know that enter conversations and they don't seem like they actually want to arrive at some sort of truth, but they just kind of want to share what they think, right? Versus actually like, wait, I might be wrong in this. Could you clarify that? Could you say that again? I want to help me better understand this. And so the wise thing is to actually seek understanding. The foolish thing is I just want to tell you my opinion, what I think. Later on in verse 10, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous man runs into it and is safe. So again, the Lord himself and his name, calling upon him, trusting in him. It's like a strong tower, a place of refuge and safety. Verse 13 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. So again, this is the temptation when you're in a conversation, especially if you're disagreeing with somebody, where you're already like preparing your answer before you've heard them, or maybe even start talking before they're finished. So you're supposed to hear, try to understand, and then you respond. But so often out of our foolishness, we just start responding. Oh, I know where you're going with this, or I have a response to that. But instead, that's to our shame and to our folly. Instead, we need to fully hear, fully listen, try to fully understand, and then out of wisdom, we can actually respond. In verse 17, we're told the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. I love this. How many times do you hear somebody, give you their side of a story and you're just like, I can't believe that happened. And then when you hear from the other person, you're like, oh, yeah, that was not as clear cut, right? And so somebody always sounds like they're right when they're the first ones to share. Here's what happened to me. But often there's wisdom in saying, all right, what did the other person say? Let me go talk to them. What actually happened? Not just taking the first account of it. And I think we're most prone to this with our loved ones. Like when you have a spouse or a child or a friend who tells you this happened to me, we just take their account of things just like whole hog. Like this is how it played out. And we completely, this is definitely what happened. And sometimes as a friend, all you need to do is listen, right? Or give advice. Here's how you might handle this. But the wise thing to do at any time, especially if we have to intervene or act, is there another side of the story? What would the other person say happened? And let me go talk to them or let me hear them out before I just jump to a conclusion based on one account. Because if two people are in a disagreement, right, they're going to usually have different understandings about what happened. In chapter 19, we have house and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. Just love this. It's a good picture of, you could say like, oh, like my parents left me this money or left me the family house. The idea that anytime you have a good, blessed, faithful spouse, that's a gift from the Lord. Like that is his gift to you. Truthfully, everything is, but I think this is just an extra good picture of that. A couple of verses later in verse 17, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. So when you give freely to the poor, it's like you're lending money to the Lord and he's going to pay you back, right? That might not be money in this life, but this is what Jesus talks about, storing up treasures in heaven. So I just like that idea. When you're giving to the poor, you're giving to Jesus, you're giving to the Lord himself. In chapter 20, we're told in verse 5, the purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. So when you think about what motivates you, often it's like a deep well, and sometimes you don't even know exactly what's like moving you to do this. This is what I think, this is what I want, but deep down, maybe who knows what kind of motivations I have. But a man of understanding who knows, how to reflect, how to ask questions, has a way of drawing that out and saying, oh, this is why I wanted to do that. This is why you're so set on doing this thing. A few verses later, this is chapter 20, verse 14. Very different topic, but he says, bad, says the buyer, but when he goes away, then he boasts, right? This is just classic business negotiations. Somebody's like, oh, I can't believe I'm cutting you this deal and I'm, paying so much for this thing. And then they turn around and say, guys, guess what deal I got, right? Like when you're in negotiations, you're always trying to act like you're, making this big sacrifice, but then you're turning around and saying, hey, I played them, right? So again, transparency, honesty is just always a better way to go. Verse 17, bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterwards his mouth will be full of gravel. So I love this because if you're gaining anything from deceit, it might be sweet for a time, but in the end you're like left with a mouthful of gravel, right? It's ultimately not going to be beneficial or good or enjoyable. You should do it not deceitfully, but rightly, justly. Towards the end of the chapter, in verse 29, the glory of young men is their strength, but the splendor of old men is their gray hair. So once again, the beauty of gray hair. And I love too that, the splendor of a young man or the glory of a young man is their strength. Like each age has its own thing. Like the beauty of children is their carefreeness, their awe of the world and how they're constantly taking things in, and they're not burdened down with all the problems of the world. And then as you're a young man or woman, you're lively and you're full of vigor and life, and you're strong and you have all this energy, and that's good. And you should use that and enjoy that. And then as you're old, you can't move as fast and you've seen a lot of life, but now you have wisdom. Now you have experience. Now you have time and patience and wisdom to pass on to others. And then our last chapter for this week, chapter 21, we're told in verse 1, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wills. So it's again a reminder that God's the one who has ultimately established civil authority. So even ones that are wicked, God has the ability to turn them whichever direction he wants. If he wants to intervene, he wants to steer them for his purposes. Verse 3 then says, to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. We saw that in the prophets too, but this idea that to do what God wants us to do is much better than even just a sacrifice paired with injustice and wrongdoing. Verse 9 says, it is better to live in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. So it's just a reminder when you're, picking a spouse, pick somebody, pick wisely, pick somebody who shares the same faith as you, pick somebody who is forgiving and willing to repent, and, you can work together. And a good reminder that once you are married, whoever you're married to, try not to be quarrelsome. Try not to be, this is for men and women, try not to be difficult. Try not to be a burden upon one another as much as possible, because that can be a pain. So the Proverbs will say it's better to live in the corner of a housetop. Another proverb will say it's better to live in a desert than with a fretful wife. So again, you don't want to be a spouse that's causing problems, because it just makes somebody want to get out of the house, right? But both husbands and wives want to be people and spouses that the other spouse rejoices to be around, right? That they love being with them. Verse 13 says, whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered. So again, if you're not willing to care for those in need, then don't expect other people to care for you in your time of need. Verse 15, when justice is done, it's a joy to the righteous, but a terror to evildoers. So again, everybody who's doing right should want justice because it's good and it's right. But if you find yourself on the wrong end of that, it's because you're doing evil, right? So we should always be hoping for and praying for justice. Verse 21, whoever pursues righteousness and kindness will find life, righteousness, and honor. So again, if you want, that sounds like a good list to me, life, righteousness, and honor, then you should pursue righteousness and kindness, right? So above all things, pursue these good things, right? And then the rest of things will take care of itself. Don't pursue just money and pleasure, but pursue God's life, righteousness, and honor, and the rest will follow, right? That's the idea. And then at the very end of this chapter, this is verses 30 and 31, no wisdom, no understanding, no counsel can avail against the Lord. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. So the idea that you could do all you want with philosophy and wisdom and understanding and science, or you could have all the military power and might and strength, But ultimately, none of that can prevail apart from the Lord. It's his doing. He's the one who's ultimately going to give success, or he can also vanquish. He is stronger than the wisdom of the world. He's stronger than all the armies of the world, which actually ties in really nicely to our question for today, because next week we'll finish out the Proverbs and we'll get into the book of Job. But our question for today says, what is up with the phrase Lord of hosts? We've read it a number of times and I've seen it a lot in the prophets. What does this mean, or what's the significance about it? And it's a good question. First, I'll just highlight the Hebrew in it. So in Hebrew, the Lord of hosts, some translations will say the Lord of armies. So the Lord of hosts, that's in Hebrew, it's Yahweh Sabaoth. Sometimes in some churches' liturgies, you'll see this as the Lord Sabaoth, right? It's not Sabbath, like, the seventh day, Sabaoth. And it gets translated as hosts or armies. It's a military term, so I think armies is actually maybe the best way to understand it. So the idea of Yahweh of hosts or Yahweh of armies. And you see this come up, it's a number of times in, especially the Old Testament, because it's Hebrew, of this idea of the Lord being described in such a way. And the reason for this, I think, is this is a title that specifically highlights God's strength, his power. Think of all of the angels that he commands. Think about stories like when Sennacherib was coming up against Jerusalem, and or maybe it was a different story, but when Elijah opened the servant's eyes and he saw like a whole army of like flaming chariot angel army like around them, right? Or like when they were going to the promised land and you have this angel of the Lord who's going to lead them into battle, right? The idea that the Lord is the one who commands all forces. He has this whole army of angels. He commands, and we just talked about the proverb of turning, the heart of the king in his hand. Like he's the one with all power, all control. And so calling him the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies, Yahweh of armies, is an acknowledgement that he is ultimately the powerful one, the strong one, right? Just as he is a loving one, he is a forgiving one, he is also a powerful, sovereign, strong one above all the strengths and powers of this world. So that's what the Lord of hosts means. If you find it any interesting context that you're curious why it's in that place, I can try my best to help decipher that. But hopefully that was helpful. Do you have any other questions about that or anything else? Feel free to send them in. But with that, I want to get you on your week, and I pray that this week especially you gain some wisdom as you go through these Proverbs. But as always, may the word of Jesus renew you day by day until life everlasting. Take care.